There is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under heaven. A time to be born, and a time to die. A time to plant, and a time to uproot. A time to kill, and a time to heal. A time to tear down, and a time to build. A time to weep, and a time to laugh. A time to mourn, and a time to die. A time to scatter stones, and a time to gather them. A time to embrace, and a time to refrain. A time to search, and a time to give up. A time to keep, and a time to throw away. A time to tear, and a time to mend. A time to be silent, and a time to speak. A time to love, and a time to hate. A time for war, and a time for peace. People of God, do we know what time it is? Are we men of Issachar who understand the times? Are we like those who look at the sky and say it's going to rain, or we feel the air and we say it's going to be hot, but we do not know, we don't understand how to interpret the present times? Are we those to whom Christ would say, you hypocrites, you frauds, you actors, you read the skies, but you cannot read the times? Church, do we know what time it is? My fear is that many of us still do not. Many of us, even thought leaders, even church leaders, even Christian MPs, even those involved in the lobbying and pro-life movement, some of us still do not see what time it is. Now, mercifully, I think many do, but some still don't. Is this a time for peace? Or is this a time for war? Is the order of the day bridge building and diplomacy? And I'd just love to understand why you just voted for babies to be killed up till birth. Or is it a time to take a clear stand and to draw some lines in the sand? Is this a time for peace or a time for war? Now, I was involved in an interesting meeting last week in London. Many pro-life leaders gathered, and in part it turned into something of a debate about this. What should be our tone at this juncture? What should be our posture? Some were advocating a much more militaristic approach. We need to see this as warfare. We need to go on the offensive. We need to stop being on the back foot. And we need to see there's a real enemy here. Of course, the real enemy is spiritual, but there is a flesh and blood element to it. So some were saying we need to be harder, we need to be stronger, we need to be more aggressive, as it were. Others are saying, no, this is not the time to get more aggressive. This is the time to realize that being aggressive hasn't been helpful, and we've been too aggressive. We need to be softer, we need to be more diplomatic. Now is not the time to write people off or cause divisions. And so what I want to talk with you today about is this. What is the order of the day? Okay, after this devastating vote last Tuesday, of course, there was Friday as well, assisted suicide. I'm not really going to talk about that today. I'm focusing just on abortion. After this devastating vote, and at this critical juncture, when abortion is being decriminalised up until birth on the part of the mothers, and no doubt they're going to try and decriminalise it for the doctors very soon as well. What is the order of the day? How should we respond? Now, in order to sort of think this through with you, I want to look at a couple of pieces written over the last week or so in the Christian media. The first is by Tim Farron, Member of Parliament, Lib Dem, Christian Member of Parliament, and the other is by James Mildred, who works for CARE, and this is an article that he wrote for the CARE website. He wrote a couple here and there on different platforms, but the one I want to look at is the one that he wrote for CARE itself. And I really want to use this as a springboard for thinking through how should we respond? What should be our tone? Is this a time for war, or is it a time for peace? So the piece I want to look at with you from Tim Farron can be found, I'll put the link in below, it can be found at Evangelicals Now. You may have to find a way through a paywall. I'm not suggesting an illegal way. You have to pay. You have to pay through the paywall to get a hold of the whole thing. But I'll give you some quotes if you're not subscribed. And this is something he wrote fresh off the defeat in the House of Commons on Tuesday of last week. Last night, he writes, MPs debated the crime and policing bill and voted by a majority of 242. A huge majority, 242, to decriminalise abortion at any gestation time when a woman has acted in relation to her own pregnancy. Now, of course, he's echoing the euphemisms there of the abortion lobby. It's not what she does to her own pregnancy, it's what she does to her own child. And the child was largely overlooked in the debate, unsurprisingly. It was very much about women and whether women should be prosecuted, very little about the baby. And we need to be very careful when we're reporting on these debates that we don't uncritically adopt the language, the framing that the other side has set up. Anyhow, he says this: I hope it goes without saying that I have immense compassion for women faced with this impossible decision. Now, of course, we should have compassion for women, and we should acknowledge that late-term abortions often are taking place in very extreme circumstances. But we also need to see that that's not the most important thing here. And even in this article from Tim Farron, which is certainly positioning itself as a pro-life article, the women get more of a look in than the babies, I would say. Okay, yes, we should have compassion for women, but first and foremost, this is about whether it should be legal to kill babies up till birth. Now, late-term abortion is a hideous thing. Abortion at any stage, of course, is an act of violence that takes an innocent life. But late-term is especially grisly and especially painful for the unborn child. And yes, it is especially dangerous for the mother as well. But again, we must be careful we're not allowing the other side to frame the debate. He goes on, the cases of late-term abortions in the news recently are deeply sad. Often stories of desperation, trauma and fear, yes, but what about the experience of the babies? They pay with their very lives for these things, these procedures, these so-called healthcare procedures. So I don't want to be nitpicky here, but it's important. And this is actually part of the bigger picture. We still, pro-life movement, we are still being reactive. We are still fighting the latest onslaught by the abortion lobby, the latest amendment, the latest piece of legislation. I'm going to come on to something right at the end of this piece, this episode, to talk about going on the front foot, being proactive, actually bringing the fight where we want it to be, or at least a step in the right direction. But one of the ways in which we're reactive, one of the ways in which we're too passive, is that we allow the other side to frame the debate. We've got to take a hold of the narrative. We've got to paint the picture of what abortion so-called really is. We're talking about the violent killing of babies in the womb. Okay, so let's not just adopt their framing. But Tim Farron goes on to say this: my party does not have a whip on such issues, and I think that's the case for most parties. Abortion is considered a conscience matter, and for that I am grateful. Now, I understand what he's saying here. Grateful that he's not forced to vote in favour of abortion. But again, we set the bar far too low. Abortion shouldn't be a conscience matter, actually. It's ABC. This is basic human rights. It's basic government practice that you shouldn't kill innocent people. Okay? That shouldn't be a conscience matter. That's black and white. That's basic. Don't kill innocent people. If you think it's okay to kill innocent people, you have a problem and you shouldn't be in Parliament. Okay? So it shouldn't be a conscience matter, actually. It should be, we can't even, is Holocaust a conscience matter? Is racism a conscience matter? No, it's just wrong. We just don't do it. And it should be whipped, and it should be whipped in favour of the unborn child, because they're innocent people. This is basic. But his point is taken. At least he was able to vote against it rather than for it, and he did vote against it. Now, the fact that he has to point that out is itself a very telling sign. Now, Tim Farron's voting record on abortion is really very poor. It's quite shameful, actually. He has abstained on so many votes on abortion, so many. And that is a travesty. Okay, for a Christian MP to abstain on votes to do with abortion is a travesty. We're commanded to be a voice for the voiceless. Frankly, what are you doing in Parliament if you remain silent, if you abstain, when one of the most basic matters of morality, of human rights and dignity comes up, and you abstain? Okay, some years back, Tim Farron bemoaned the fact that Christians were getting in touch with him, urging him to vote pro-life in a similar bill, but they were not talking so much about other issues, and he thought this was very boring and predictable, and why couldn't they write to me about the other issues? As if they didn't need to write to him about abortion, but they did, because his voting cannot be counted on, actually, when it comes to abortion. So unfortunately, he has been quite dismissive of the pro-life cause, and we can't take for granted he's going to vote pro-life. In this case, he did. Praise the Lord. But it's not always been the case. Now, he goes on to talk about the issues with decriminalisation and why he opposed it. He's right, it increases the opportunities for coercion from an abusive partner into a dangerous late-term abortion, yes. It's dangerous for women, yes. He does mention it's unsafe for the unborn. He mentions it, but I don't feel they're given as much weight as the women here. But anyhow, it's important. But what I really want to focus on here with you is the way in which he seeks to position the issue and then try to direct people's tone or posture when it comes to this. Pro-lifers, he's really issuing something of a directive to pro-life Christians. He says this: "However, I urge us as Christians not to focus on this one issue in isolation. This has happened in the US, where abortion becomes the key battlefield in a culture war, where your stance on it is considered to define your entire political outlook. To go that way is to allow vulnerable women and vulnerable unborn children to become pawns in a war of words. The abortion debate is so often toxic," and so on. Now, I'm really tired of this trope that to be unequivocally pro-life is to be embarrassingly American. It's to enter into a culture war, and how sort of unnuanced to allow this to be the defining issue. What could be more defining than whether or not babies get killed? Okay, this is not a hobby horse. This is not exaggerating something out of all proportion and making a mountain out of a molehill. We're talking about whether to kill babies here. Okay, now reasonable minds can disagree over levels of taxation. Okay, how much immigration is appropriate? How do we manage it? Reasonable minds can differ. Reasonable minds cannot differ on whether or not to kill babies. Okay, so let's not denigrate, let's not demonize, let's not villainize people who say this is the defining issue, because it is. If you are not alive, you can't have any other benefits or rights. Okay, this is absolutely essential. Yes, this is the hill to die on. And if that makes me sound like a Trump supporter, who cares? These are human babies being killed. Now, it doesn't mean other issues don't matter. It doesn't mean we don't address other issues as well. But unashamedly, this should be right at the top, because life is paramount. And really, Tim now starts harping on this same theme that he harped on the previous article I mentioned, when people were writing to him saying, will you vote pro-life, and how boring and predictable that is. He seems more offended by, as he sees it, the tone of the abortion debate than he is by abortion itself. The abortion debate, he says, is so often toxic, lacking in respect, sensitivity. Now, what about the abortion procedure? Isn't that toxic? It's literally toxic. They literally inject a baby with toxin, with potassium chloride into the heart. This is late-term abortions. They inject a baby with a chemical so painful, they don't even use it on criminals on death row without anaesthetizing them first. They don't use it on animals when they're putting them down unless they anesthetize them first. There is no law or regulation saying you have to anesthetize the baby before injecting this torturous poison. Okay, don't tell me the abortion debate is toxic. Abortion is toxic. Okay, poisoning babies is toxic. Don't tell me the abortion debate is lacking in respect. Abortion is lacking in respect. It is the deepest, most invasive form of disrespect for babies and women to break entry into the womb and kill that unborn child. And Mother Teresa said it's two deaths that take place in that instance. There's the death of the child, but there's also the death of the conscience of the mother. It's not unforgivable, but something irreversible has happened in that moment. That is lacking in respect. Respect for life, respect for God who created life. Let's not be exercised by the tone of the abortion debate, which actually is tamer than it should be, probably, because we're talking about babies being killed. And then apparently the debate is lacking in sensitivity. Well, again, where is the sensitivity for unborn children? It would not be inappropriate to, if it were fruitful, stand on street corners and shout. It would not be inappropriate, if it were fruitful, to talk about this every minute of your life. Because we're talking about babies being tortured to death. That's the insensitivity. Talking about it, even strongly, is by comparison nothing. And then Tim says, where's the curiosity towards the other side? I observe in both the US and the UK a lack of understanding of or compassion towards people who take a different view. There's a danger that both sides end up dehumanizing either the women who are affected or the unborn child, or both. I'm sorry, I just don't buy this. A view that says let's not kill babies is not in danger of dehumanizing the babies as much as the side that says let's kill them. Okay, this is a red herring. This is strange argumentation. Okay, protecting babies from being killed is always the right thing to do, even if you get a bit heated when you do it. And is this really the time? This is my question. Is this really the time for curiosity towards the other side? Oh, that's interesting. You just voted for babies to be killed up till birth. That's so interesting. I'd love to hear more about that. I'm not saying the time is completely over for persuasion. I'm all in favour of understanding where people are coming from, finding common ground, and reasoning with them. But we need to see when there are moments that happen in history where lines have been crossed, and we need to wake up and get with the programme. I'm not saying we stop reasoning altogether, but is this really the word for the moment? Let's be curious about why people just backed this. Let's be curious, and we'll come on to the MPs in a moment. Let's be curious about why they supported that. As we look through Scripture, we see there are times to be reasoning with people. Help me understand where you're coming from there. There are times to preach. There are times to persuade. There are times to discipline. There are times to warn. But there are times to utterly oppose and expose and humiliate even. Jesus humiliated his opponents sometimes. There was a time for name calling, actually. John the Baptist, Jesus, Paul, the whitewashed tomb, whitewashed wall. Think about John the Baptist talking, or Jesus talking about people as foxes, broods of vipers. Okay, there is a time. There's a time to get strong. Again, I'm going to suggest that this is such a time. Okay, because if babies being killed up till birth isn't enough, that we say maybe it's not the time for diplomacy, maybe it's the time for war, and I'm not talking about physical violence here, but I am saying, can we step up a bit and realise just how much we've lost? And we have been too soft, we've been too tolerant, okay, and in doing so, we show that we are really desensitised to the reality of what's going on here, the violence that's being done. Okay, I don't think the word for the moment is let's take more of an interest in what these bloodthirsty, demon-possessed, in some cases, advocates of abortion are pushing through our legislative system. Yeah, I think Jamie Bambrick has it much closer to the truth than Tim Farron. He put out a video, "Our leaders are demonic." Yes, this is demonic, actually. Okay, child sacrifice is demonic. I'll come back to that later. But I don't think this is a time, really, for us to call up the tone police, and as if the most important thing is that we just have a really lovely, understanding conversation about killing babies. David Robertson wrote a good piece. Didn't we all have a lovely assisted suicide debate? Because out of the assisted suicide, I think it's the second reading he was writing after, all these MPs came out congratulating each other on what great, Parliament at its finest. We had such a good debate about whether or not to kill the elderly. Aren't we so civilised? Now, I think this is very telling because Tim Farron goes on to talk about a campaign in America called the Compassion and Conviction campaign, known as AND. He says it's led by a friend of mine, Michael Ware. Now, I thought that's interesting. Let's look up Michael Ware and see what he's all about. Now, quite unsurprisingly, Michael Ware is a Democrat who actually worked for President Obama, that very bloodthirsty baby genocide supporter and propagator Barack Obama. And he was the faith outreach director for Obama, which means he was working to convince gullible, pro-life, so-called American evangelicals and others, Christians, that it's okay to vote Democrat. You can be pro-life but still support a pro-baby genocide president. So here's from one piece. So again, I can put the link underneath. Ware is an unusual figure in that he's a Democrat with extensive experience trying to bridge the gap between social conservatives and progressives on abortion. In his newsletter, Reclaiming Hope, he tried to imagine what a national compromise might look like post-Dobbs. Okay, so this is after Dobbs. Roe v. Wade's been overturned, massive pro-life victory, but Michael Ware was quite keen to reduce that victory and find a nice compromise that Democrats might be happy with. It goes like this. This is him writing now. A sustainable compromise would include the following elements: a federal ban on abortion, post-viability, so we're talking about after 24 weeks, 22 weeks, something like that, with exceptions for life of the mother, rape and incest. The legalisation of abortion up to a certain early stage in a pregnancy, somewhere perhaps between 8 and 15 weeks, depending on the makeup of the coalition to support such a bill. The floor. The codification of the Hyde Amendment, and a few other details. So essentially, he's advocating for something a little bit like our current abortion law. Abortion for any reason up until a certain point, and then after viability for certain specific reasons. So that's his vision. His vision is abortion on demand, effectively, because most abortions happen before 15 weeks anyway. And this is one of Tim Farron's heroes and friends. The thing about compromise and bridge building and finding common ground is, I'm not saying there's never a time for it. It depends on the issue. On some things we do need to do that. But what happens is you end up being used by wicked people to draw gullible good people into wicked causes. Okay? Compromise, syncretism, is not the way to change the world. It is the way to be changed. And look at what happened with Obama. He absolutely advanced the abortion agenda with the help of Michael Ware. Okay, so compromise is not the order of the day. It should not be our approach to abortion. And yet Tim Farron is upholding this guy and his project as a kind of example of how we can be both and we're not too strident, and we find that common ground, we bridge, build. And then Tim goes on to fall into, I'm afraid, one of the classic traps that our adversaries are trying to get us to fall into. This is just a classic trap. Tim says we need to be consistent with the contentious ethical issues dealing with beginning and end of life, abortion, assisted dying, capital punishment. Bit of a caveat there. Agreeing with capital punishment, for example, for murderers does not mean you're not pro-life. In fact, that can be seen, I'm not going to discuss it in detail just now, but that can be seen as a very strong support of the dignity of life, because, for example, in Genesis 9, when the Lord himself commands the death penalty for the shedding of innocent blood, it's precisely because he values innocent life that he does so. So let's just put a question mark there. Being pro-life doesn't necessarily mean you're against capital punishment for things like murder. But it also means, he says, being consistent with other issues in the middle of life: maternal mortality rates, low pay, the 2-child benefit cap, health inequalities, and the housing crisis. Now, here is just such a classic trap that pro-lifers are being duped into on both sides of the Atlantic. You're not really pro-life unless you also ... And then they fill in a whole load of other issues, which are sometimes also important, sometimes they're much less important, but they're just different issues. It's a red herring because, of course, even if a pro-lifer can be accused of not being consistent on other issues where the right answer is clear, that doesn't prove it's okay to kill babies. So they're just using this as a distraction. Bad people can make good arguments, all right? So let's grant pro-lifers are awful people. It still doesn't mean it's okay to kill babies. It just means they're not living out their views consistently across all issues. But the issue is that when pro-lifers fall for this, they get duped into diluting themselves, distracting themselves from the most important issue. They buy into this idea they have no right to speak unless they all adopt 20 children and solve every problem of the world. But also what's kind of rushed through here is an assumption that there is a correct Christian answer to every one of the issues mentioned. So, and also that they are related or not related to abortion. Maternal mortality rates are actually related to abortion, for example. So being pro-life, opposing abortion, does actually help maternal mortality rates. Tim then mentions low pay and the 2-child benefit cap and the housing crisis. Now this actually connects with some very complex questions of the extent of the role of the state, whether the state should be feeding us and housing us and educating us, complex economic questions, minimum wage, does it slow the market down? Does it ultimately increase or decrease wealth? Health inequalities, again, to what extent is it the government's role to nanny us at that level, and how has that worked out over the last few decades? Have we become healthier? Okay, so we can't let people tell us we're not pro-life if we're not pro-free housing, or we're not pro a certain minimum wage, or we have a certain view of immigration. We just can't allow that to be rushed through almost just as a separate point. There are Christian answers, I think, to all of those questions, but probably not the answers that Tim has in mind. But more importantly for our purposes here, we cannot be distracted. We absolutely must oppose child sacrifice, baby genocide, regardless of other issues. But yes, we should also look at those other issues. But the main thing I want to focus on here from Mr. Farron is this. He says, "You may draw different conclusions to me on these issues." And indeed, there were Christian MPs voting both ways last night. I was shocked when I read that. There were Christian MPs voting both ways last night. And Tim makes clear his position. He voted against it. But he seems to think it's permissible to disagree on this. You may draw different conclusions to me on these issues. Now, there are some issues where Christians can disagree. Okay, so in the first century, Jews, Gentiles coming together, one in Christ, should we eat certain foods? Should we eat pork? Should we eat food that may have been offered to an idol in the market? There are debatable issues. Whether or not to kill babies is not a debatable issue. Okay, this is not an agree to disagree issue. This is a primary and indeed a very obvious moral question, and there's only one right answer. Now, on 2-child benefit cap, health inequalities, low pay, yeah, agree to disagree. I'm not going to be shunning my brother for having a different view on the exact levels of taxation. Okay, but if my brother thinks it's okay to kill a baby, we have an issue, and it's not a minor issue. But Tim Farron seems to be okay with the fact that some Christian MPs voted that way. Indeed, he himself has abstained on plenty of abortion votes. And he kind of lands as if this is the most important point. I'm certain that we all need to be able to model Christian compassion without condemnation. And he goes on to say, these issues are necessarily emotive, but as we seek to love our neighbour, it is also our responsibility to seek to recognise the humanity of all involved, to show curiosity about the reasoning of those with whom we disagree, to genuinely love and seek to understand others, and not to show hostility towards those who disagree with us, even if we are treated with hostility in return. Now, yes, we love our enemies always, but there is a time to be firm, and there is a time to call out evil for what it is. And this is such a time, especially with Christian MPs. I was shocked to read that. Christian MPs voting for this. Okay. Now, Christian MPs, this is very serious to support child sacrifice. You read Psalm 106 and you find that child sacrifice, sacrificing babies to idols, the idols of those days, Molech, etc., the idols of our day, autonomy, choice, feminism, whatever it might be. Sacrificing babies is actually an act of sacrifice to demons. Okay, it says that in Psalm 106. Christians should not be involved in demonic child sacrifice. I shouldn't have to say that, but I do. Christians should not be involved with, they should not commend, they should not legislate for, they should not endorse child sacrifice. An act of offering children to demons. Okay, in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 20 to 22, Paul makes it clear, idols are nothing in the world, but it's to demons that sacrifices are made, and we cannot participate with demons and in the Lord's Supper. Okay, we cannot be in communion with demons and also in communion with the Lord. Okay, this is actually a church discipline issue. If you have someone who is commending child sacrifice or unrepentantly practicing child sacrifice, or an MP who says he's Christian or she's Christian in your church who just voted through child sacrifice, I want to say that is a church discipline issue. They should be disciplined. Because killing babies is wrong, and not only is it wrong, it's detestable to the Lord. The Lord hates lying lips. He hates hands that shed innocent blood. He abhors child sacrifice. It's not unforgivable, but it was enough for him to say he abhorred his own inheritance in Psalm 106. It was enough for him to say in Jeremiah 7 and elsewhere, it was virtually unthinkable to him. It didn't even cross his mind that his own people would do this. Okay, this is a spiritual crisis that we've got Christian MPs in that House of Parliament voting through child sacrifice. It's to our shame. This is a red line. And it's not the time, frankly, for private conversations, come alongside your Christian MP, I'd love to understand, how did you come to that view, tell me your concerns. No, it's the time to get those people out of the house, vote for other people, vote with your feet, okay? They do not deserve our support. Just because someone calls himself a Christian doesn't mean they deserve our support in the House of Lords, because this is basic, this is ABC. If you don't know that governments are not meant to kill their own innocent people, you need to get a different job. You shouldn't be in the House of Parliament. Christian or non-Christian, this should be basic. Okay, you're in the wrong profession if you think it's okay to kill people who've done nothing wrong. Okay, and they've had their chance. Those Christian MPs, those other MPs, anyone who voted for this needs to be voted out. We need to put people in there who stand for life. The time for persuasion for those people, I'm afraid, has elapsed. Now, all strength to those who are going to keep on trying to persuade them, and maybe some can be turned. The Lord can turn the lights on at any time. But this is the time to say that's unconscionable, and we cannot support that, especially when Christians do that and think that's okay. So that was really Tim Farron's take on it, and I just want to briefly refer to some of the words from James Mildred, which I think echoed this. Now, there's plenty in both pieces that I agree with, and James Mildred wrote just about what an evil and dark day it was, and I agree with him on that. But again, this theme of now's not the time to get nasty. And I'm not saying we get nasty, but I am saying we need to actually call a spade and be a bit firmer than we've been thus far. He kind of goes on this theme in a similar way. Just because your MP voted the wrong way does not mean you should write them off completely. Voters, I think it is actually. It does mean we should write them off completely. If your MP thinks it's okay to kill babies, get rid of them. I encourage you to contact them again and explain why you're unhappy, but be gracious. Yep, we should be gracious. If they voted the right way, contact them and say thank you. That's good. Colossians 4:1-2 says our conversations should always be gracious and salty. Maintaining the relationship may open up further opportunities in the future. In a sense, that's always going to be true. Maintaining a relationship may open up further opportunities in the future. But there comes a time when we also need to say, we need to wake up and smell the coffee, and we need to see that what hasn't been working isn't likely to work. Chamberlain famously came back, didn't he, from his meeting with Hitler and said, unless I'm much mistaken, we shall have peace in our time. The thing is, we're living in a time of war, but we still have a peacetime mentality. We have Chamberlains when we need Churchills. We have peacetime leaders when we're in a time of war. We need wartime leaders. And there is a time for diplomacy, but there's a time for war. And again, I'm not talking about physical violence here, but I am talking about it's time to get those people out of Parliament who think it's okay to kill babies. And we need to stand ourselves in elections if there's no one else. But we need to work on getting people into Parliament who care for life. James quotes Colossians 4:1-2 and says we should always be gracious and salty. Yes, it does say that, but we need to weigh Scripture with Scripture. And there is plenty in Scripture where we see, for example, Elijah and the prophets of Baal. Was he being gracious? You could say in the truest sense, yes. The truth is always gracious. It's always more gracious than encouraging deceit and idolatry. But he was pretty firm there. In fact, he mocked them. Is your God on the loo? Okay, was he being gracious there? Was he being salty? We've thought already about Jesus, John the Baptist, Paul, calling people names, humiliating them, offending them, calling them blind. When the disciples came to Jesus and said, don't you realize that the Pharisees were offended by this? Jesus says, leave them. If the blind lead the blind, they both fall into a pit. Okay, so there is a time to talk tough, actually. There is a time to talk tough. James Mildred goes on to say, maybe our cynicism presents in a different way. We don't think our efforts were wasted, but we question the wisdom of a more modest, gracious approach to advocacy. If only we'd been tougher. If only we'd been stronger. If only we'd taken a more radical step to persuade our MPs. All I will say in response to this is to point you to Jesus. He is our pattern and example. And in him, we see truth and grace combined. Yes, that is true. I agree with what James is saying there. The problem is in our churches today, the assumption is all too often that to mimic Jesus, to imitate Jesus, is to be mild and never tough. In fact, I think if we see Jesus standing against the stoning of a woman caught in adultery quite firmly, how much more would we see him standing against the slaughter of the innocent by the guilty? As we look at the example of Jesus, I think he would be flipping tables right now in the houses, not grabbing a coffee and having a collaborative conversation with those who are advancing baby genocide. In the meeting the other day with these other pro-life leaders, someone I think had a helpful comment to make. They said there's a difference between, as they put it, campaigning and politics. Campaigning is you try and persuade, you try and press a point, you sit down with people, you try and help them see differently, you try and see where they're coming from. But when it comes to the election, you need to see, don't vote for him, don't vote for her, vote for me, or vote for him, vote for her. Okay? And we are constantly, it seems to me, on persuade mode. And we're never on get rid of that person, get this one in mode. And it's time. It's time for something radical. They just won by a massive majority. We need something radical here. It is not the time for a slowly approach. I want to finish by pointing you towards a radical strategy that we're about to launch. I'm not actually going to disclose it just at this moment in time because we need to go public at the right time. So we're going to keep the powder dry just for the moment. But I just want to tee this up by saying, in the words of, I think, Napoleon, if we stay in the defences, anyone who stays in their defences is doomed to lose. Okay, we just will lose. For as long as we're reacting, as long as we're on the back foot, we're always going to be losing. Now, we should react and we should defend. But the problem with the pro-life movement is we've been way too reactive and defensive for way too long. We need to go on the front foot. We need to be much more militaristic, actually. I'm not saying we need to be violent. I'm not saying we need to be ungracious. We can still be respectful and kind, even when we're being tough and forthright. But we need to go on the front foot. We need to bring the fight on territory that we have chosen and kick the ball right down the pitch so that the game is taking place in a completely different location. So I'm just going to say, watch this space. Not going to say much more about what this is just now, but we're talking about a radical offensive. And I hope and I pray that Christians across the country will get on board with this. It's bold, it's ambitious, but we just have to take the fight to them. We cannot be on the back foot again and again. So that's my message today. There is a time for war and there's a time for peace. There's a time for diplomacy and there is a time to figuratively use force. And of course, the weapons we use are not the weapons of this world. We're not talking about physical violence. We are talking about prayer. We're talking about the Word of God. We're talking about exposing the reality. We're talking about going on the front foot. But we must be done with this idea that upsetting a pro-abortion MP is somehow more of a slight on our Christianity than the Christians who just supported child sacrifice in Parliament. That is a crisis, it's a spiritual crisis, and until we see it as such, and until we get rid of this idea that Christians are free to vote for whomever, whatever party, even if they support child sacrifice, we've got to be done with this neutrality. We've got to get real, and we've got to work and pray to get people into that house who honour the sanctity of life.